Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. Today, we have Bonnie Snyder with us. Bonnie is the High School Outreach Fellow at FIRE, and she is the author of the book Undoctrinate, How Politicized Classrooms Harm Kids and Ruin Our Schools and What We Can Do About It. And y'all go ahead, you can pre-order it now. What is September 14th is when it comes out, right, Bonnie?
That's right.
So before we talk about this book and all of Bonnie's research, Bonnie, did you bring something to drink to our conversation?
I did. I brought Perrier is what I'm drinking today.
Okay.
Because they were out of the Pellegrino that I normally buy at days.
David, you?
I've reverted back to Diet Coke. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm
disappointed.
Yeah. Well, you could add some bourbon into it, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll tell you what I'm doing. You know, these hard seltzers are kind of becoming the thing, right? And Texas is like into these hard seltzers. And so Austin has all their own brands. And so I'm going through the Texas brands of spiked seltzers. Shotgun is the one that I'm doing today. So there we go. Yeah.
Very Texas. Shotgun.
I know.
I'm curious.
Well, the last one, if you remember, was Ranch Water. So
yes,
that's why
I like that name.
I'm making it through the Texas brands. Anyways, all right, Undoctrinate. Bonnie, I know you started this book and you've got so much insight because as the high school outreach for FIRE, you're on the front lines of hearing stories of parents, students, teachers. I mean, tell us how this book came about and what its main thrust is, and yeah, just that.
Yeah, absolutely. At FIRE, we hear from mostly, parents, we hear from students, and we hear from teachers as well, who are as frustrated as you can be with what's going on in the schools right now. And so I think I've probably been working on this book as a hobby really for almost the last decade. I know that a lot of us have been aware that our schools have been if not hotbeds of what you could call indoctrination, that there's been sort of this low-grade chronic problem that's been festering. And when people bring it up in the past, they've sort of been poo-pooed and ignored, or I guess the current term is gaslighted and told it's not happening. And parents have been inclined to just focus on getting their own kids through, which is part of what has allowed this problem, because the parents and the students come and go, but the teachers stay, and little by little things have ratcheted to a point where it's gone from being this low grade chronic condition to being seemingly suddenly very acute and no longer tolerable. So Undoctrinate is basically about how indoctrination shortchanges students and what we can do to restore robust free thought to our schools. So, I came up with the title just thinking, well, we need to undo this indoctrination. And I thought, we need to undoctrinate the schools. So that's where that title came from.
Yeah, I see that one of the things that you're saying in the problem, and this is really fascinating to me, and I wonder why you think the origin of this is that teachers are acting as parents and taking over that role and kind of superseding parental roles. How did that seep in? How did that ideology of teachers? I mean, we know that now teachers, you and I were talking before we came on recording. I mean, teachers are not even telling parents some of the stuff that they're doing. How did that start?
I mean, I really think that it starts with a mindset. It starts with a level of certainty that your position is so right that it justifies anything that you might do to promote it. including, any means necessary because the ends justify the means. So at FIRE, we like to talk a lot. For those who don't know, FIRE is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. We defend constitutional rights on campus. That includes free speech. So we're very concerned with issues like the chilling of speech, the narrowing of the opinion corridor, and defending dissenters. We have had a high school outreach program. Normally FIRE's operating sphere is higher education, but because we realize that kids are showing up now on campus with these really unusual ideas about free speech that aren't necessarily constitutionally accurate, we've had a department now for 5 years where we've been doing this K-12 outreach, which is how I'm hearing about these problems that I'm also experiencing myself. So I would say part of it is just this mindset of certainty. I think that some of the ideologies that we are now confronting adherents to them seem to become possessed with a certain amount of messianic zeal that causes them to promote it in a way with which ideas normally are not in the classroom. I would say that the temptation to misuse the classroom for partisan ends is eternal. And this problem is much broader than what, the current buzzword is CRT, critical race theory, but we're just as concerned at FIRE. We're nonpartisan, and we're just as concerned with anybody misusing the classroom. Back in the day, it might have been promoting a certain denomination's preferred prayers in the classroom, or other ideas with which not all families might agree. So typically in the classroom, you're going to be promoting sort of this lowest common denominator of community values, things like honesty or hard work or kindness, and things that we all agree on, and that we would have a looser hold in the classroom when it comes to different values. And traditionally, values are in the realm of the parents, of the family, and teachers, are not trained in which values are the right values to hold. They are not certified in what are the right values to hold. There's no such thing. They're certified in either English or in history or in gym, and we don't need the phys ed teacher telling our kids what the right way to think about the 2020 election is. That just is beyond the scope of their professional duties. So, in terms of the genesis of this book as well, I said that I have experienced this. I have my own personal experience with these problems probably goes back to when I was in graduate school myself. I think I'm among the last group of probably students to go through American schools before it got weird. I graduated high school in the early 80s, college in the late 80s, and it was still, there was liberalism on campus. I went to Harvard as an undergrad. It's certainly known as a liberal college, but it wasn't promoted the way it is now. I never had a problem with any of the professors, although I did. Interestingly, I was only assigned one book more than once during my whole undergraduate time at Harvard, and that was the Communist Manifesto. It was assigned to me 6 separate times, which I could speak more about that. But I really can relate, having had to pull my daughter out of a school, and it was for partisan teaching, but more than that, it was for the straw that I could have gotten past that if it was the type of a teacher who could have listened to feedback and altered her teaching to accommodate reasonable feedback. But instead, what I experienced was lying. And at that point, I was like, you're not just a bad teacher, you're a bad person. And you are not a suitable role model for my kid or for other people's kids. So that was a deal breaker for me. That was at a private school. My kids mostly went to public school, but that was a private school. We have noticed that this problem at FIRE, we've noticed that it seems to be most advanced in affluent school districts, which would include privates. I think there are still some pockets where it hasn't reached. Thankfully, in the United States, we are a decentralized system of schooling, for better or for worse. But when it comes to bad practice, it's for better. But just this past week, in the last 10 days, there have been 3 really interesting stories that I think really reveal the extent to which the contempt for parents is manifesting itself, or at least the main one is that a teacher in let me think where she was in Utah. And this is a teacher who didn't make it past the first day of school this year. She showed up and she sort of told this, and she did tell the students that you need to get vaccinated, which of course is her opinion, medical decision for the families. You know, she's not a medical doctor. She told them they should get vaccinated, and that that if they're and that they shouldn't, that they don't have to listen to what their parents say. You don't have to listen to your parents. Most of y'all parents are dumber than you are. She told the students that their parents are stupid. She said, if you don't agree, you keep it to yourself because I'm just going to make fun of you, which I think really, it's so interesting that she verbalized a lot of what we already know is going on. She's going to use her position of authority in the classroom to demean her students, to get them to agree with her. She has no respect for their parents. And she actually said, go ahead and tattle to me about me to the administration. They aren't going to do anything anyway. Which might have been, you know, the students called her bluff. Students filmed this, so you can watch the video of it. And to their credit, the school did fire her. So that, like I said, that probably was what did it in. The other things they might have been okay with, I don't know, but that was too much, and she's done. The other two that are really interesting was, and is so revealing of this sense of invulnerability that these teachers have. And the other thing that really inspired me to write this book was just noticing how badly they were violating just really fundamental teaching practice and educator ethics. And all of these teachers are just bragging about what they're doing. They have this total sense of invulnerability and immunity from which obviously hopefully now is shattered. The second one was a teacher who went on TikTok to giggle about how she removed the American flag from her classroom because it made her uncomfortable, she said. And she has a gay pride flag in her classroom. And when students asked her how they could salute the flag when it wasn't there, she encouraged them to salute the gay pride flag instead. And I think she's under investigation. And then
she removed the American flag. Just I'm making sure I heard you right, and put up a gay pride flag. And they asked if that wasn't something that they wanted to salute, and she said to salute it anyways. Did I hear that right?
They said, how can we do the Pledge of Allegiance without the flag in the classroom? And a student said, well, there's another flag. And she sort of jokingly said, why don't you do the pledge to the gay pride flag? This is again a video that is available, so you can see it for yourselves. And just today, I think a teacher was fired or is about to be fired from what I'm reading in California. And this one is a real whopper. I actually have this list that I started probably about 8 years ago of what I call whoppers. And I just write them down. And this is how I sort of wrap my head around what's happening. I was hearing a lot of anecdotal stories, and I don't include those because I can't verify whether somebody's exaggerating or telling the truth. So whenever there's a published story, which didn't used to happen very often because of fear of retaliation, but I think that the fear of what's going on is now greater than the fear of reporting it. So in any case, this is one of the biggest whoppers I've seen. Was this teacher this teacher exposed himself on video, and he talked about how he has 180 days to radicalize his students, and he gives them extra credit for participating in, marches and other activism, which is another big problem is, this sort of civic engagement. It goes by a number of different names, but it's not classroom learning. In New York, we had the whole school district let out to participate in the climate change march. But this teacher was exposed for, and he had these teachers seem to like having flags up in their classroom other than American. He had an Antifa flag up in his classroom, and he was apparently actively promoting Antifa. And a student indicated that it made him or her uncomfortable, and he implied that that makes you a fascist to the student. So there's a really fiery school board meeting that I haven't finished watching yet, but you can view that online. And actually, the comedian Rob Schneider tweeted about it, and he said, "Never in my life did I think I would sit through an entire school board meeting, but I was riveted." So that's just a little of what's going on right now in K-12.
So thank you. That's fascinating. Um, so obviously, there's this robust discussion going on around critical race theory in the classroom, and it's been interesting to watch because we were watching it and debating it before it became the big public debate that it is today.
Right.
And at first, the people who are sort of denying that it's done at all are saying, well, that's not CRT. CRT is some arcane legal theory taught in law schools. But then they'll say, but it is very important that schools teach systemic racism about systemic racism in the classroom. And when I'll say, well, are you arguing that all America is systemically racist, or there might be systemic racism in certain institutions? How would you characterize systemic racism? Is it a discussion, or is it something you're going to tell students exists?
Right.
And most of them are very matter of fact. Yes, it is a fact. It is not an opinion.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how much you've encountered that, and how much you think it's currently being taught that way in the American classroom or in various places.
Yeah, I mean, I can't quantify exactly how widespread this is anecdotally. It's, as I said, it seems to be fairly prevalent among affluent communities. That is exactly the problem. I mean, there's a difference between teaching something as an idea to think about and teaching something as a conclusion that must be accepted and affirmed. And that's where we get into what at FIRE we call compelled belief, which, the Supreme Court has proscribed in West Virginia versus Barnett. So I don't, FIRE, we're a free speech organization. We're not going to say that we're not for censoring ideas. That being said, I'm not so sure that critical race theory really is developmentally appropriate for the ages that has now filtered down to. I think it's really a rather esoteric academic theory, kind of for graduate school analysis among people who are well versed in introductory knowledge. I don't think it's a good introduction to a field of study. I think that it's demanding too much of kids, and they're likely to pick up on what kids pick up on. They're sort of learning, I think, to weaponize some of this terminology to gain status among their peers and to put down other people. So the way that it is being deployed in K-12, I don't think is as pure as it once was in academia. I think it's sort of like a game of telephone where it's passed down and it really doesn't bear a lot of resemblance. But we're talking about a theory, not a theology. And when they're working backwards from conclusions is the problem. And that is really not how the scholarly process is meant to operate. It's supposed to be open-ended, where we, examine evidence and then we reach conclusions. But they're basically saying, here are conclusions, and now we want you to retrofit everything you learn into this summative critique of American history, which is so bleak and negative. And I don't have a problem with critiques, but it's like you don't understand War and Peace by reading a review of War and Peace or a criticism of War and Peace. You read it, and then you might read some criticisms that shed different perspectives on it. And it's sort of like reading a review of a movie or reading a review of the movie that was made out of the book that you're not going to read. So I just feel like it's not the best learning exercise, and certainly the anecdotes that I'm hearing confirm that suspicion.
Yeah, it seems to me that if you wanted to teach about systemic racism, you could easily look at a case study, let's say like Flint, Michigan, or something in the criminal justice system, and you could expose students, I'm talking about, juniors and seniors in high school or whatever, to arguments on both sides. John McWhorter says X, Ibrahim X. Kendi says Y.
Right.
Now, what do you think about it? Go out and tell us how you thought of McWhorter's argument. What did you think about Abraham Kindy's argument? What's the difference? What are the assumptions that they each hold? And then you could actually help students and develop critical thinking skills and still teach about the problem of systemic racism without telling kids what to think. And I haven't seen any examples of that anywhere except maybe in what I would do in my household or what you might do in your household. But I haven't seen that in any way, shape, or form, put out there in the education sphere. Am I missing something? Does it exist, or it just exists in very rare places?
I think that one of the things that is happening is that a lot of good teachers are afraid to tackle controversial issues. So they're the ones who are sort of shying away from debates in the classroom. Kids aren't getting enough practice with it. But the people who are the most strident in their views feel very empowered to impose these one-sided lessons on students. So I think there's too little of what you're describing going on and too much of the one-sidedness happening. I think students should be exposed to a certain amount appropriate of controversial topics. Please, not all controversy all the time. That's just exhausting. But a reasonable amount. So I think to some extent there's too little of it going on. And then there's too much of the heavy-handed, ideologically driven. I call it sort of like pre-chewed, pre-digested content that's being delivered to student, which is really a very low-level learning activity. If you've ever studied Bloom's taxonomy, the very lowest level, when I was a young teacher, I used to get scolded for having too many activities that were at the lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy, which is mere memorization. And that's where indoctrination falls. The kids, if you ask kids, they know what the teacher wants to hear. They're very quick at picking that up. And if you really think, I take comfort in the fact that kids are sharp. And that I think a lot of these teachers who think they are indoctrinating kids are failing at it, because I don't think kids appreciate it. Maybe they do succeed with some of them, but most people don't like being treated this way. And so I take comfort that adolescents inwardly are rebelling against these efforts.
You said something that I just want to kind of highlight, maybe you can expand upon, is you see this happening in the most affluent areas. I thought that this is more of a kind of a public school problem. I know it's part in the private schools as well, but can you expand upon where you see this problem and maybe why it's more in the affluent areas than in other areas?
Yeah, well, now that you put it that way, I think that we also are seeing it in some urban school districts that have a lot of minority children where teachers feel that this is helpful for them. So maybe we're seeing it sort of at both ends of the continuum. I think the place you're least likely to find it would be in, rural areas far removed from cities and affluent suburbs. But I think you are finding it in urban areas, and I think you are finding it in affluent areas. And I think that, it kind of is an affluent mentality meant to, I guess, empower the people that they think are being discriminated against. But ironically, and a lot of other people, a lot of scholars that are in touch with us and that I'm sure you're familiar with, feel resentful of the disempowering way it is discouraging kids and really keeping them from developing agency. And we do hear a lot of minority parents who are stepping forward and saying, please stop telling my kid that he is a victim of this omnipresent oppression from which this country will never be free. How is that helping my kid? So organizations like 1776 Unites has a lot of scholars who are trying to oppose that kind of messaging and pointing out that this really is not helpful to their kids. Please stop doing it.
And I asked that because it was interesting. I was taking notes as I was reading your book, and it seemed to me really it's a public school crisis. I know we see it throughout private schools as well. But what is worrying me is that so many people who have the means take their kids out of public schools, and maybe this is again more in the urban areas, take their kids out of public schools to put them in an environment that they think, has more aligned with their values. And so if that is the case, then we are actually exacerbating a problem where we are creating a bigger socioeconomic divide. We are not addressing diversity at all. We are actually we are regressing in the sense that we are segregating, if you will. So these good intentions could end up have the exact opposite effect.
Agreed. And there is a lot of anxiety. There have been a couple of good articles that have come out recently. One of them, I think, is private schools have become obscene. That might have been a Barry Weiss article. There's a lot of soul searching going on right now in private schools. And actually, I think adopting some of this ideology is one of the ways that I think they're trying to assuage some of the perhaps unconscious guilt maybe that they're feeling over exactly the distance that you're describing. And ironically, one of the best ways to improve the public schools in urban areas would probably be if the private schools closed. That being said, I'm in touch with and hearing from quite a few private school parents who are very concerned and, I think have the best of intentions and want to do the right thing and are trying to improve what's going on there, and that are certainly generous benefactors and donors to a lot of great causes and organizations. So, I mean, there are obviously good people and bad people in all of these organizations, but what we're talking about are sort of trends that we're observing that are really, I think, reaching a peak. I mean, I have a really good feeling right now that the pushback this year is going to recalibrate things in a positive direction and restore some semblance of balance.
We've read recently that the accrediting institutions for private schools are enforcing certain diversity standards that are being used in the curriculum in these various schools. And I'm wondering if you've looked into that at all, if you understand the relationship between these accrediting bodies and private schools, and if there's anything that you think could be done on a legal front in some of these places. I mean, to what degree are these accrediting bodies sanctioned by the government to accredit schools? And does that, and I have no idea, so I'm asking a question I really don't know. And if they are, does that make them at all susceptible to what Congress might say about it? So that's the question. Oh, by the way, I think it was Caitlin Flanagan who wrote the article about private schools that you were referring to, not Barry Weiss.
Okay, thank you for that correction. Yeah, as for accrediting agencies, I would say a couple of things. One is that FIRE has fought accrediting agencies in the past. One of the tools that FIRE uses is basically strongly worded letters where we point out, some important factors that these organizations might not be considering before we would file lawsuits. And NCATE is the accrediting agency for teacher education, and a lot of this does go back to the education schools, which is a topic we might want to touch on, because I think this is really where the battle needs to head. There has been a lot of, I'll just go ahead and call it rot in the education schools for a very long time. I'm an alumna of Penn State's College of Education, and I could say a lot about that. But at NCATE at one point was trying to require teachers in training to demonstrate certain dispositions, which basically is saying that your mindset has to agree with the opinions that we want you to hold. And these dispositions had to be social justice oriented. And that's, of course, a buzzword for certain, a certain worldview and certain perspectives. And so there are a couple of really interesting, well-written letters by Will Creeley that went to NCATE, and FIRE was successful in getting them to drop that standard, because it was basically saying you must think the way we expect you to think in order to become a teacher in this country, which is very un-American. And as for accrediting agencies in K-12, I am in touch with parents who are trying to fight this battle among the private school accreditors. which I believe are regional, because they're trying to deal with a regional one. As for the public ones, I'm not exactly sure what the official government sanction of them is. I'm not one of FIRE's attorneys. I'm an educator. But there are things like Middle States would have been the accrediting agency that was in charge of the schools that I attended and that my kids attended. Normally accrediting agencies look at really simple things like, are the teachers in the school certified? Do you offer, what is the range of courses that you offer? How many credit hours are required for graduation? Do you have books in your library? Is there a librarian? They're kind of just counting these factors to make sure that the school meets minimum standards. I haven't heard any problems personally about public school accreditors, but I am hearing some about private school accreditors, and trying to do the same sort of things with diversity statements. And schools must affirm these sorts of views. And I've also heard some concerning things when schools are being evaluated, that they are pushing ideologies that some schools, have in their founding language. That private schools are allowed to stand for something, to be mission driven. Public schools have to, of course, accept everyone, but private schools can be more selective. They can, you could have a private school that's a Catholic school. Obviously they're going to be promoting a specific worldview. So we and this sort of brings up the other problem we're seeing in schools now, which it's so interesting to me how my kids are now in their 20s, but when they were in school, the programming that they were mostly subjected to was anti-bullying programming. And so I'm working on an article that I'm calling, like, from anti-bullying programming to bullying students in the classroom, which is just so ironic because and this anti-bullying programming was often run by outside organizations that really were not certified teachers, and they would come in, and my kids hated it. They would deliver this rather substandard programming with this very milquetoast, sappy messaging that most of the kids, I think, kind of rolled their eyes at. But apparently, it kind of, I think Greg Lukianoff might say that it hypersenses. He is the president and CEO of FIRE, and he wrote Coddling of the American Mind. And he wonders if some of this programming didn't hypersensitize kids to overreact to the least bit of adversity in their lives, verbal adversity, and to demand that, authority figures provide, stop it, instead of, when we were kids, we were told to handle it ourselves for the most part. And I do think, I don't think there's much anti-bullying training going on in the schools. And I've talked to school administrators who I think who have acknowledged to me that it was very unsuccessful and kind of a complete failure, if not counterproductive. And now what we have is this DEI training coming in. And again, there's an explosion of organizations now that are offering it. There's no one vetting it for quality. There's no real credentials for who's an approved provider of DEI. And that's influencing a lot of these accreditors' statements, a lot of what's going on in these collective belief messages that schools are putting out. And my question is, who are these people, and why are they qualified to be in the schools? Because in a public school anyway, you're supposed to be in front of a licensed professional at all times. And in an extreme case in the Boston public schools, they had outside people coming in and basically conducting unlicensed therapy in the schools. And you could look that up. I think there was a whole expose on that in the Boston papers, and they had to get them out of the schools. So there's a lot of unregulated mental programming going on in the schools right now, which needs to be reined in my opinion.
So you mentioned something going beyond accreditation, but let's talk about teacher training. I'll tell you experience of mine. I was looking the other day at one of my local school districts teacher application that they use, and you have to commit to, and the words, it's the social justice, the equity, and whatnot, even as an application. Which I found shocking. And again, here's the thing though. I mean, we know that we've twisted our language, right? I mean, equity means something different to some people than it does to others. So, I'd like to think that it's coming from a good place, and maybe a
Right.
place that just doesn't realize that the language has been twisted. But when I hear that teachers have been trained this way, I can't help but to think that there's something more behind the curtain. So can you tell us a little bit about how teachers are being trained and how this has influenced the K through 12 education space?
Yeah, and I know that our lawyers at Fire are looking at these diversity commitments that are now being included in application packets for professors. And I wasn't even aware that it was happening with K-12 teachers, so I'm going to have to look into that. That doesn't surprise me. As far as teacher training goes, I have a big section in my book where I look, where did this problem come from? And I talk about downward drift from the academy. I look into the numbers of how unbalanced the faculties are in the different schools. And of course, the social sciences are among the most unbalanced. Um, and I looked at the curricula at different uh, graduate schools of education. There are two different types of education schools, I should point out. I've actually taught in a college of education. So some students just get their teaching credential as part of their undergraduate degree. And that's the kind of program where I was teaching developmental psychology courses. I personally got my certificate as an alternate route uh, teacher candidate, and that's where you get an undergraduate degree in a liberal sub discipline, and then you do it at night, and the school pays for me to go. So I probably had as little teacher training as you could have and still get your certificate. Um, but then there are the graduate schools of education, and these are the ones that have the most prestige, and these are the ones where I think the imbalance is probably the steepest. And Harvard's Graduate School of Education is up there, but I think probably the one that has the biggest reputation with the most influence on other schools would be Columbia, the Teachers College there. And so I went and looked at their curricula, and I would encourage other people to do the same. And you will find very few classes there that look like, at least when I looked, which was probably about a year ago now, that look like they're going to help teachers to be prepared to help students learn to read, write, and do the other sorts of tasks that we associate with school. The the strong political ideological bents of these classes are amazing. I was assigned the same way that I was assigned. I can't remember if this was. I think while we were talking on the recording, I mentioned that I was assigned the Communist Manifesto 6 times at Harvard. And when I was in graduate school, the book that is over assigned is typically Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is, the name it's whenever you're talking about oppressed or oppressed, you're in neo-Marxist or neo-Marxist territory. And that actually, when it comes to transparency, I think that I'll just diverge, or take a tangent for a second. I think a really useful question for parents to ask if you're wondering what's going on in the schools is to just ask, is it Marxist? Um, because it goes by so many other names, and I think that really cuts to the chase. And I'm not even opposed to Marxism being taught because I think it's an important ideology for everyone to understand. I am very opposed to it being taught without any contextualization or counterbalance. And before I go back to the teachers' college, I'll just give the example that happened at my daughter's school, which is that she was given the Communist Manifesto to read in high school, which is long before I was given it. And I thought, okay, well, yeah, I guess this school, private school is a little advanced. And then she was asked to debate the merits of communism versus capitalism. And the entire class, other than my daughter, agreed after really deep analysis that communism was a much better system than capitalism. And she said, I tried to speak up for capitalism, but I wasn't given any readings or any content or any material. So I had nothing to say other than, well, capitalism is what puts food in the supermarket. That was kind of her level of analysis. And yeah, so the fact that a teacher would run a sham of a learning exercise like that without providing any sort of countervailing views in an American school. There's all sorts of, content on capitalism that Adam Smith, read an excerpt from
Sure.
the Exactly.
Yeah.
And they just think that you're supposed to absorb this by osmosis, but it's really hard to see the picture when you're inside the frame. And so I just was like, this is, this is not the level of pedagogy that I expect from a school that costs me any of my hard-earned capitalist dollars. So, but yeah, back to the education schools. It is long past time for there to be a huge correction in the education schools. There's also the issue of professional ongoing training in the schools. Like, I'm looking on calendars of my coworkers, and they're marking the days when their kids aren't going to be in school because there's going to be professional development going on. Well, who's delivering this professional development? What exactly is happening? Because there are teachers, the same way that students are filming their teachers because they are offended by what's going on in their classrooms. We have teachers who are keeping tabs, and some of them are resigning. Paul Rossi is an example. Dana Stengel is another. I saw one in Loudoun County, and a lot of it is over the training that they're being subjected to. And when they speak up, they are exposed to retaliation. I know that Paul Rossi, when he spoke up, I believe, had a letter put in his file that accused him of creating a neurological imbalance in the students, which I just find hilarious. I mean, if I had that, I would frame it. If somebody wrote a letter, but I would be so proud of having done that.
That's
It doesn't even
hilarious.
mean anything.
What we're talking about, these education schools being reformed. Jennifer and I interviewed Lyle Asher, who had
Yep.
written a couple of the articles on this, and
Yep.
it hits me that that's a tremendous undertaking because it's been so many years in the works, and they've so institutionalized what they do, and even to the degree, I'm sure, of purging anybody who doesn't fit the bill. Those are people who are not going to last in that environment. They're not going to get promoted. They're not going to make have jobs for the long term, and bringing in people who are might be the equivalent of like a party activist, and then also that's what you have. You have an institution that's dominated by this sort of monoculture. And I know that there's two schools of thought on this. One is that, okay, well, we've got to reform these institutions, and the other is we got to create new institutions. Where do you fall on that divide?
I think in K-12, we need to create new institutions. I really do. And I hope that I can be part of maybe making that happen. I think that the ed schools are failing, and I think that this monothink, as it filters down to K-12, is being exposed as being as bereft as we all knew it was. And so now I think that what's the right word? I think that the reverberations are now going to resound upward. I think they are as bankrupt at this point as they can get, and I do think I'm going to be optimistic here and say that we're at the point where there has to be a positive change. But
Is that because that we're up close and personal with the change movement? We're all enmeshed in it all day long, and that it seems to me sometimes when I leave my bubble of those of us who are pushing back, a lot of people don't even know that this culture war is happening, let alone that there is opposition. They're not aware of what their kids are learning. I just wonder if that, yes, there's no question that the backlash is much further along than it was a year ago. I mean, I think that's without question. It's getting more organized. We're all getting more organized, but I just don't know to what degree it's perceived as such by the people who are promulgating these policies in schools. Do they just say, "Oh, we're to see this as a minor nuisance of people who are trying to challenge their hegemony," or do they see us as a serious threat to that hegemony?
And let me jump in there before you answer, if you don't mind, Bonnie, because I just want to give an antidote to that. I was on a call the other day with people it was a debate on, basically CRT in schools. And here's my thing. It's not that I think that people don't even know what's going on. So the people who were the question was, should we teach like race in schools? It wasn't about CRT per se. They didn't use those words, or anti-racism. So a lot of people who were on the pro side we're talking about like, yeah, of course we should teach history. Well, but no one is against that.
No.
And that's so they've pitted people who believe that that CRT or critical social justice is wrong. They've made them out to be, they don't want to teach history. And that showed up very clearly. These were, quote, common people, including myself, who were having this discussion. And again, common people, I don't say that pejoratively, I'm one of them, believe that the question was, well, of course we should teach about like history and slavery.
And that's a classic Mott Bailey false. Yeah, it's a logical fallacy, which brings me back to a really important point, which is that, up until the 1950s, logic was a required course for anyone really to get a liberal arts degree in the United States. And, around the 60s, we removed that. And at this point, it really, really shows, because I hear logical fallacies and false arguments being promulgated as convincing evidence pretty much every day. And we're going to work with probably a new organization called the Mill Center, specifically to reinvigorate critical thinking and critical analysis. We at FIRE have created what we call our discourse clubs, that I would encourage people to go to our website and check out at thefire.org/K12. And we have 5 levels that we want to lead kids through. And so basically it's an after school club where kids can do what you're supposed to be doing in school anyway, which is learn how to have debates and how to engage constructively with one another to discuss important issues. The shallowness of our thinking, which we are seeing throughout our culture now, really does frighten me. And actually, I have a quote here that I wrote down after the recent, whatever you want to call it, let's just say bungled operations in Afghanistan. The president came out and here's what he said. He said, "There has been complete unanimity from every commander on the objectives of this mission and the best way to achieve those objectives." Really? And he said this in order to reassure us that I guess the best minds were on the case, but that's a bad thing. That's a really bad thing. This idea of unanimity and what you're describing with these DEI statements, these commitments, there's this idea that we have to have consensus on issues, or the other term that floats around in academia is collegiality. And that's used to insist that if you dissent or if you disagree or if you interrogate, so basically don't look closely. That is literally the definition of groupthink, as Irving Janis defined it when he did a post-mortem on the Bay of Pigs disaster.
Yes.
Dissent is good. Disagreement is good. And if you think that everyone agreeing in the room means that there are no other opinions in that room, you're a fool. And that's why at least I take the comfort of knowing that when teachers think they've got this consensus, they actually don't. But the problem is, there's this great book called The Captive Mind by, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the name of this Polish writer, but or Czechoslovakian rather, but he basically talks about how, in an oppressive culture, people learn to become very good liars. And that frightens me tremendously, that our children are learning how to lie to go along, to get along. And that is not what we were like as kids. We were like spunky and rude, and our teachers, that was encouraged among American educators as part of the American spirit. And again, I can't think of anything more dispiriting, discouraging, and disempowering than the current ideologies that many of us are now fighting in the schools.
So, Bonnie, before we let you go, I lived in China for so long, and I see that kind of group thinking, and it really disturbs me. But we could talk about that forever. What your book is also providing solutions for what we can do about it. Yep. What are some of your top solutions that you would give to, again, let's talk to the common folk, like us as parents who aren't educators, how we can come to a solution for our kids?
Yeah, so I wrote down a couple of the top ones here. I think, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to trust that your teacher is going to function in loco parentis like prior generations could. And you are probably now, as a parent, going to have to at least have a more than a passing familiarity with these ideologies. And you'll need that because you're going to have to, we're in a vaccination world right now. You're going to need to inoculate your kids against this by explaining to them this worldview. And then you're probably going to have to do the teacher's job, if it's not a good teacher, of contextualizing it and counterbalancing it at home. You might have to supplement. I have some really good ideas on that. If anybody wants to write to me at highschooloutreach@thefire.org, I have a lot of curricular supplemental ideas for ways to fill in the gaps of what's missing. So you're probably going to have to debrief inoculate them before and debrief them afterwards and stay on touch with what's going on. I'm a big believer in the learning standards. And as boring as they are, I recommend everybody go to your state website for the Department of Education, wherever you are, and learn the learning standards for your child's grade and each subject. And when these loose lessons come along, you need to go in there and say, I'm sorry, but exactly what learning standard is this aligned with? Because if it's not aligned to one of the learning standards that's been democratically adopted by the state, that's a misuse of your tax dollars, and the teacher has if it's a public school, private schools have their own version of this. I would also recommend that you familiarize yourself with the codes of ethics that govern teaching. There are codes from actually some really good ones, believe it or not, from the teachers unions. I don't think that they, promote them or that they necessarily encourage their members always to adhere to them, but they're well written and you can refer to those. And there are also ethical codes within, probably for each state in the country. I haven't looked at all 50, but like in Pennsylvania, they have a very good admonition for teachers that I would encourage all teachers to mind, which is, before you undertake any action in the classroom, ask yourself this question: whose needs are being met, mine or the students? I think a lot of this ideology is being promoted because it's the teacher's interest more than it's what's right for the kids. And that is not what you're paid a salary for. You can pursue your own interests in your own time, but when you're in the classroom, you are hired speech to deliver the curriculum that was assigned to you by your district, in concert with the state. I would also say that if it's true that, the Frankfurt School at Columbia has brought about this so-called long march through the institutions, which we, maybe are seeing coming to fruition, I would just assert that it's time for the long counter march to begin.
Mm. We're ready to join you. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, and please also, I would encourage parents to check out FIRE's high school curriculum materials, which are standards aligned, are dealing mostly with constitutional issues in hopefully engaging and relatable ways for kids. And those are freely downloadable. You can use them at home to supplement. You can take them to school, encourage teachers to use them. So we have a host of resources for families and educators at thefire.org/K12.
I'll be sure to put that in the podcast notes too. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And my book, check out my book.
Yes, that will be in the podcast notes too. I'm very excited. I'm so excited that I got an advanced copy. I can't wait for other people to read it and to discuss further.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for having me today. I appreciate your interest in this important topic.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you.
Thanks so much, Bonnie.
Thanks, Bonnie.
A pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.